I'm going to introduce Terence, and then you'll be in for an experience that I think you'll find instructive, entertaining, inspiring, and challenging. This lecture is, this evening is an independent lecture, but it's also the introductory part of a workshop which will continue tomorrow and Sunday, 9:30 to 3:30, for those of you that might want to go into these subjects more in depth. And Terence, I think, will give you some indication of what will be covered in the workshops tomorrow and Sunday. So Terence is I think I would like to say that Terence, who is my good friend, is one of the most remarkable individuals I know. He is an explorer, a student of shamanism and of history, of ethnobotany, and of a whole variety of other disciplines which would be too numerous to list. He has a very unusual gift for articulating with exceptional clarity connections, insights, and understandings from really the frontiers of human exploration and knowledge. He has a gift for combining scientific knowledge with poetic, sensuous expression that is quite exceptional, and he has a truly visionary mind that is able to range deeply and widely across a very wide spectrum. And it's impossible to put Terence into categories. He transcends the usual kinds of academic categories. But the topic, the focus of this workshop is on ethnobotany and shamanism. In particular, his work in the last several years has focused on the preservation, the study, and the preservation and propagation of knowledge and information about the use of botanical plants in the context of the expansion of human consciousness and knowledge. And I can assure you that if you haven't heard Terence before, and even if you have, you're in for an exhilarating journey into spaces of the mind that you won't forget. So with that, I'll turn you over to Terence McKinnon.
Well, I want to thank Ralph for an introduction that will be hard to live up to. I want to commend Ralph and CIIS for the act of intellectual courage that inviting me here represents. I'm sort of returning to my home turf after a year spent in the Hawaiian Islands, where Kat and I were managing a botanical garden that is a nonprofit foundation specifically set up to preserve plants with a history of human usage, foods, drugs, fiber plants, food plants, all the plants that are part of the spectrum of human interactions with the botanical world. I'm sure you're all aware of the crisis in the world's rainforests, that they are being cut down and radically affecting the ecosystems in the tropics and by implication the whole world. But what is not so well understood is the impact on tropical cultures that capitalism and modernity is having. These tropical tribal cultures are much more fragile than the rainforest itself. Every time we go to the Amazon, we are struck by how much information is being lost irrevocably because people who in a former time would have become apprentice shamans are instead becoming the foreman of sawmills and that sort of thing. So I've been away in the Hawaiian Islands. I'm delighted now to be back in the fast, deep-flowing current of American culture. I certainly feel that that's what it is after a hiatus that brought great peace of mind but not a whole lot of excitement. Before I make my way into tonight's subject, I'll cover what I think of as preliminaries and business. First of all, as Ralph said, this is the opening lecture of a weekend that will be conducted all day tomorrow and all day Sunday. In addition to that, I'll be speaking at Shared Visions tomorrow night on a completely different subject in Berkeley. So if any of you are interested in attending the follow-on meetings of this workshop, you should see the staff of CIIS. If you're interested in hearing what I have to say about a new calendar, you should come to Shared Visions tomorrow evening. How many of you heard the talk on KPFA today? A few, so I shan't fear if I repeat myself. I want to call your attention to a couple of projects that have finally been completed. Psilocybin, the Magic Mushroom Grower's Guide, which has been out of print for about 5 years, is now back in print with more photographs, expanded text, better paper, etc., etc. Anyone who is interested in literally cultivating a relationship with a shamanic ally, this is the place to begin. Also, Lux Natura, which is the company, which is sort of a clearinghouse for my ideas, tapes, and books, has completed work on a software package, which is software which runs on the Apple IIe, 2C, or 2GS machine, software which supports the theories of time that are explained in the invisible landscape. This was an extremely arduous task of conceptualizing and then turning it into software. My colleague Peter Meyer, the best debase hacker around, is here tonight. Peter, why don't you stand up and share the glory? So any of you who have that kind of a machine and are interested in the ideas in the invisible landscape, this is our best shot. This is state-of-the-art stuff. At the moment, we can do no better than Time Wave Zero. Very briefly, I want to mention an article in this month's Magical Blend. Graphically, it's by me, I called it Alien Love. They called it Love Aliens. Graphically, I think they took revenge on me for knocking Crystal Power, but the text is there if you're interested. I'm going to talk for 45 minutes or an hour, then we will break, and if you're interested in what Lux Natura has available, there are catalogs here. There's another piece of paper which describes the work that Botanical Dimensions is doing, and also I want to promote a very interesting event that's going to take place in November, a conference here in San Francisco called Angels, Aliens, and Archetypes, which should be very interesting. It's going to happen at the Fairmont Hotel, and besides myself, Whitley Strieber, who wrote Communion, which is now on the New York Times bestseller list, I understand. Jose Arguelles, who I understand has disappeared into the Imperium, will descend to share his thoughts on UFOs with us. Jacques Vallée will be there. Ken Ring, the near-death experience man. Michael Grosso, who wrote The Ultimate Question. Richard Grossinger, a number of other people, people that I have wanted to publicly debate for years. So I think it should be a very lively weekend conference. There are flyers on that. Okay, so much for all of that. The theme, the overarching theme of this weekend here at CIIS is psychedelics, before and after history, shamanism, and ethnobotany. The succeeding meetings will deal with the details of shamanic usage of hallucinogenic plants worldwide in a kind of survey format with special emphasis on those places and peoples that I have personal experience with, which is the Amazon basin and Southeast Asia. And I understand that if you are a student at CIIS, there is credit for that. Tonight's lecture is an attempt to set the stage and sort of enunciate the philosophical themes that stand behind the effort to understand and enumerate psychedelic plants and their usage anyway. I mean, what is the point of it? And the reason I called it, or the reason I invoked history before and after, is because I think that the psychedelic experience, especially as it is induced by plants, is a phenomenon that too little has been made of in an effort to sort of preserve the chestnuts of modern science and society. The psychedelic experience is an extremely old part of the smorgasbord of human experiences on this planet. In fact, the emergence of human consciousness and the emergence of an awareness of the properties of these biodynamic alkaloids scattered throughout a number of plant genera may be nothing less than the same thing. We know that the arboreal primates of Africa, at a certain point in the past, and people of goodwill differ on exactly when, came under pressure from an advancing phenomenon of desertification of the African continent. And at that time, new lifestyles, new adaptations had to be put in place. The arboreal canopy dwelling lifestyle of these primate tribes had to be put aside. They descended to ground level. They abandoned vegetarianism in favor of an omnivorous diet, and their already highly evolved system of signaling became even more evolved as they took to hunting and preying upon herds of ungulate animals that were evolving in this grassland situation in response to the same set of environmental pressures that were forcing the primates out of the trees. Roland Fisher did work showing that visual acuity is increased if small amounts of psilocybin are given to graduate students. Psilocybin in doses that are sub-threshold for the triggering of psychological changes. And in fact, he made the point to me when he told me about this, that this was a clear instance of a drug allowing a being, a person, to have a truer picture of reality than if they had not ingested the drug. But Fisher, who was a psychologist, never drew the conclusion regarding what the consequences of such an increase in visual acuity would be on the lifestyle and adaptive skills of an animal. It's very clear in the same way that if you have a plant in your diet which stimulates or challenges your immune system, that will increase your adaptive advantage. It's very clear that the presence of a biodynamic steroid or alkaloid which increases visual acuity will also have a tremendous impact on the adaptive strategy and the success of that strategy in a given animal. So it's possible to suggest that once psilocybin was established in the food chain, those primates that utilized it quickly became the dominant and then the exclusive form. Well, now, how did this psilocybin enter the food chain of these primates? Very simply, because it was coprophytic, meaning it grew in the manure of these ungulate animals, so that once the ungulate animals became a food source and a focus of interest and attention of these primates, they could not help but notice as they tracked and followed these herds that the mushroom was thrust upon their attention. If any of you have observed Stropharia cubensis, which is the species I'm speaking of, growing in the tropics, you know that it is quite an astonishing natural object to come upon in any environment. I've seen them the size of dinner plates in the Amazon, and they have a very rich golden color, and they rear their heads above the surrounding grasses in the meadowland situation. In fact, they actually look like small fleets of flying saucers that have come in and settled on the grass. To this day, baboons have the habit of, baboons are also primates of this grassland environment. They have the habit of rushing over to cow pies and turning them over and picking up bugs and searching for protein in this way. So it is no great leap of faith to suppose that very early on they would have these primate animals would have noticed the presence of the mushroom directly in their path, and being omnivorous, they would have eaten it, and first in small experimental doses which confer increased visual acuity, that would have established a selective reinforcement loop in favor of those animals with a taste for mushrooms as opposed to those animals without such a taste. Very quickly they would have bred out the other preference, and very far-seeing monkeys would have been established. The next level of the argument requires a somewhat greater leap. It has to do with the fact that at increased doses, the psilocybin in these mushrooms seems to activate the language-forming centers of the brain, Broca's area, or the ceruleus. It isn't clear, but what is clear that experientially these things are catalysts for language, and that from the signaling repertoire of these primates to the act of signification is a symmetry break, a leap into the unknown that it is reasonable to speculate was actually triggered by the presence of these biodynamic plants in the diet. Once that happened, there is the establishment of a set of associations. The cow, the mushroom, which in the mind of these creatures, I'm sure that the mushroom was thought of as coming from the cow, because after all, the manure came from the cow, and it seems to be just a seamless web of associations. So the cow, the mushroom, and lying ineffably behind that, the experience of the tremendum, the experience of an ineffable mystery that now, some 100,000 or 35,000 years later, is no less mysterious, in spite of the fact that we have made an immense intellectual conquest of the world in which we live. We extend our metaphors of explanation to the most distant stellar objects and down into orders of magnitude of the physical universe, many levels beyond which we can perceive with our unaided senses. Nevertheless, this tremendum that these early primates contacted remains precisely that, a mysterium, a transcendental mystery that beckons across the epigenetic landscape of human culture and organization. And some of you who have heard this lecture or these ideas before know that it is my opinion, going beyond Gordon Wasson, that this really lays the basis for the genesis of religion. Religion begins in the notion of the holy. The holy is another way of indicating the felt presence of the tremendum. And the early goddess religions of the Middle East were essentially cattle religions. There are people in this audience who have done tremendous work on the etymology of these languages, showing how these words and roots can be traced back into a kind of convergence where the mystery and the mushroom are seen to be one. So this means that in spite of the prejudices and intellectual predilections of Western man, which are essentially pretensions that have arisen in the dimension created by ignorance, the dimension of ignorance created by the Judeo-Christian attitude toward nature, which sees it essentially as something to be exploited rather than integrated or made a resonant part of the psyche. In the light of that ignorance, the connection to the vegetable world has fallen away. Although even as late as the 19th century, mythographers and mythologists like F. Max Mueller and Fraser were talking about the vegetation goddess as a kind of archetypal category into which all of these early religions could be subsumed. Then in the 20th century, this idea fell into disrepute. And the interest in the psyche became detached from the historical career of man through time and became a kind of, a hologram, if you will, the Jungian hologram of the archetypal matrix, which, if you've ever read Jung, you know that he has very little appreciation for historical chronology. He will cite a 16th century alchemist in the same breath that he will cite a 4th century hermeticist or a 16th dynasty papyrus text, because his notion was that the collective unconscious was somehow atemporal. And there is something to that, but beyond and beneath that is the greater reality of the accumulation of this experience with these plant hallucinogens. It's interesting that to this day, in the rainforest ecologies of the world, the faith has never been broken. And in a way, that brings me then to the second theme, which is after history. History, you see, is a kind of prodigal wandering, a kind of breaking of faith with the vegetation goddess, a descent into what Merciliade called the profanity of history, away from the paradigmatic world of ritual and magic, and into the secularized, linear progression of historical phenomena based on technological advance. However, because it rests on no epistemic bedrock, it is simply a cultural assumption. It is now, in our own time, playing itself out. The fact that it has a false bottom can now be seen as we, through modern anthropology and modern chemistry and pharmacology before it was repressed and shut down in the 1960s, we have rediscovered the mystery almost by accident and then quickly acted to make it illegal, inaccessible, and trivial. These seem to be the three ways that we deal with drugs. We make them recreational, or illegal, or inaccessible. All strategies for turning away from the real implication, which is that man, as a thinking creature on this planet, is necessarily a portion of a symbiotic relationship. Man, without the synergy that these plants have imparted to the formation of our genome, is no better than a monkey. So that, recognizing that, we are forced to recognize that the experience of spirit, for which most of us rely upon the testimony of Meister Eckhart and Juan de la Cruz and Hildegard von Bingen, is in fact a birthright of each and every one of us. But the bias of the scientific mentality, which is the bias which says the world must be known through the pristine agency of the unencumbered observer, it has to be abandoned. And by unencumbered, I mean unstoned. This is the idea that nothing is true except that which emerges from the most sober sorts of reflection, in every sense of the word sober. And yet we know that a substantial portion of the meaning of reality is contacted in the Dionysic excess, in orgy, in the abandonment of the sanctity of the individual ego and emerging into the group mind of the tribe or even the condo complex in our own time. Yes, so that... But that entire spectrum of human experience, the group-minded, emotive, orgiastic, swept-away spectrum of experience is denied, and in its place is put a real horror of nature. And when you have horror of something, you move in such an epistemic murk that you give yourself permission to destroy. The rape of nature has been analyzed as precisely that, a rape, a subjugation of the feminine. And it certainly is that, but it's something else as well. It is a horror that gives permission to to destroy. A microcosm of this, which everyone who works in the Amazon is aware of, is the myth of cannibalism in the Amazon. The myth of cannibalism was specifically promulgated to give white people permission to carry out atrocities on the native peoples, because it was said they are homophages. The most horrifying thing we can imagine, gives us permission to deny their humanity and then ride roughshod upon them. And on a larger time scale, this kind of relationship has been extended to all of nature. Now, because of the work of people like Hoffman and Wasson and Metzner and Leary and earlier people, Lewin and others, the 20th century has come full circle. We have dug so deep into the toy box of matter that we have actually come upon the residence of the God, or the residence of the mystery, and it cannot now be denied. This is, I believe, a lot of what the cultural struggle over hallucinogens and the impact of plant-induced hallucinations is about. It is that science cannot continue as usual in the face of this phenomenon. It is what the parapsychologists have been seeking, but have not the courage to proclaim, because so strong is the bias against drugs in this culture that automatically anything having to do with drugs is ruled out of bounds in the realm of evidence, precluding forever, in my mind, the validation of these phenomena. So-called psychic phenomena are an everyday occurrence where hallucinogenic drugs are taken. But where hallucinogenic drugs are not taken, these things must be sought by the most tortuous and excruciating kinds of methods, you know, the flipping of cards and that sort of thing. Even, and I don't want to dump on Whitley because I don't know the man, but I read his book. I was amused, those of you who are aware of Whitley Strieber's book, Communion, he takes great pains to say that he never uses drugs. He even has an appendix in the back of his book, which is a polygraph session, where he insisted that he be asked the question, do you use drugs? Well, to my mind, it's no wonder the poor man can't understand what is happening to him. Without a symbiotic relationship to the biodynamic, God-laden constituents in the exterior natural environment, the unaided human mind is almost certain to fail in its effort to assimilate the mystery of being. Because throughout the historical and prehistorical career of human beings, this is how understanding was achieved. And, I bring great wrath upon myself by suggesting that even the most respected methods of spiritual transformation, such as yoga and mantrayana and that sort of thing, are in fact efforts to mimic the intoxication of plants without committing the heinous act of ingestion, you see. Again, this a masculine paternalistic society has such a penetration fear, such a fear of having Mother Nature come at them with the large, thick reality of things that, excruciating ordeals will be substituted in lieu of that. Not eating, flagellation, sitting for hours and hours, obeying for years the orders of beady-eyed opportunists. All all of this sort of thing will be tolerated in lieu of making the commitment to nature. That's what it is. It's a commitment to nature, to the efficacy of nature. And by our now I mean the rationalist scientific view of nature is that it is something entirely passive which we perceive, and that the act of perception, to become an act of understanding, has to go through all kinds of transforms and processing in the human brain. Nothing could be further than the truth. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the Gaia hypothesis, which fundamentally is a theory about gas exchange in the atmosphere, but which really says that the planet is a self-regulating organism in which we are moving around, playing a role somewhat like an organelle in a cell. The consequences to be drawn from the Gaia hypothesis is that nature is not a passive matrix which requires analysis, but that in fact it is communication. That the perception of nature is the perception of nature's intent. And if we could, and this begins as a kind of outlandish notion, is nature talking to us? Is that what is happening? And ends, I think, in the conviction that that is absolutely what is happening. We do not live on this planet. We live in this planet. Hundreds of miles of atmosphere rise above us. We move along on a kind of membrane, which we call the surface, but which is really simply a symmetry break in the physiology of the planetary organism. The planetary organism, for us, is a continuous stream of communication to us, which we deny. And we deny it by strategies that have been spun out over millennia. One of which is, of course, the subject-object dualism inherent in our languages, the notion of the passivity of the exterior, the notion that mind is a phenomenon, in fact, an epiphenomenon of the functioning of brain. We are unwilling to see that mind is a flowing river into which the brain is inserted much in the way that a dipstick is inserted into a crankcase to take the measure of the lubricant. That's what we are doing. And there's a lot of talk about paradigm shift, what will it be, where will it come from, etc., etc. And people keep claiming they have it, but I don't think people realize, they have trivial paradigm shifts or mini paradigm shifts. The real paradigm shift that is being acted out in the 20th century is a return to the archaic notion of the primacy of spirit. And it was contacted first and most abstractly by quantum physics, where it was finally realized, when all other intellectual avenues had been exhausted, that particulate matter, conceived of as tiny billiard balls whizzing through empty space, was going to have to be replaced by a notion of fields, of interacting fields described probabilistically and not really localizable in the here and now kind of matrix that we are used to moving through. But they called the new concept of matter probabilistic or wave mechanical. It actually is not mechanical at all. Waves are not mechanical. Wave mechanical is a curiously bastardized kind of term which tries to have it both ways. But how many of us are quantum physicists, and how many of us who are actually have access to the instrumentalities that confirm these notions? So it emerged and is emerging then in other areas, such as abstract art and the effort by the precursors of abstract art, the pataphysicists, the Dadaists, and the Surrealists, to introduce the notion of an animate and active unconscious. The notion of the unconscious is actually an effort to blur the notion of the point consciousness of the ego and to replace the model of the point consciousness of the ego with this more deployed and fuzzy notion of a gradation of awareness spreading out to the very earliest memories of animal organization, you see. But all of these intellectual efforts to launch the paradigm of spirit have been somewhat academic and removed from the ordinary experience of people. What is not removed from the ordinary experience of people is the availability of the psychedelic experience, conceived not as a kind of masturbation where the laboratory facilitates the experience through the production of historyless drugs absolutely empty of morphogenetic content, but through the acceptance of the fact that this generalized communication from nature is most excruciatingly focused and particularized in these information-bearing molecules that have been evolved over billions of years in the biosphere by the matrix of life itself for purposes of communication. All of life is really an ocean of communication, and this is now being understood even by the hard-nosed Darwinian evolutionary thinkers. It is really not all tooth and claw. It is not survival of the fittest. It is survival of those who can cooperate best with those around them, of the same and different species. Well, the essence of coordinating cooperation is communication. And the essence of communication is the free flow of linguistic intent. We're all familiar, I'm sure, with the way in which ants regulate their behavior by the laying down of pheromones. But, and that seems quite acceptable to us because we say, well, the average ant is not such a big deal. It is the hive which is so exquisitely organized and coordinated and able to execute its intent and carry out its plans. But, have you noticed that the individual atoms of the human hive are no great shakes either in most cases? I'm speaking now to an intellectual elite, self-selected by being able to get yourselves here this evening to this kind of an event. But I'm sure you all are aware of the public opinion polls which show that the average high school graduate cannot locate Venezuela on a map. And similar things, believes that Hermann Goering served in the Nixon administration. And someone said, but he did, didn't he? Only his spirit. So coordination of communication is really what these psychedelic compounds are about. And once this is recognized, I think the role of the spirit as a transforming paradigm begins to come into focus. You see, it is not enough, and this is again another argument I have with the so-called mystical tradition. The intent of the mystical tradition seems to be to trigger the experience of the presence of the tremendum. But in fact, what is necessary is to be able to act in the presence of the tremendum, to execute behaviors based on the felt experience of the tremendum. And this you do not get. You get a strange quietude, a quiescence, a glorification of the hermitage and the monastery as being somehow concomitant with an awareness of the spirit. Nothing could be further from the truth. An awareness of the spirit carries with it an obligation to action. Obligation to action within the context of, and I say this as generously as possible, the hive. So that the appearance in modern times of the anthropological data and the pharmacological sophistication and the botanical sophistication to recognize the role of these psychedelic plants in the formation of human culture is extremely important. It seems to me it is the seminal event of the 20th century, toward which all the other things I mentioned, Freudian and Jungian psychology, modern art, nostalgia for the archaic, etc., point. And one can almost make the metaphor that we are approaching a new level of self-unfolding as a species, comparable to adolescence in the individual. What happens in adolescence is that the DNA reaches the place in its program where there is a symmetry break and a new set of messages begins to be sent. Hormonal messages. You can think of them as pheromones within the body. That's what a hormone is. An organic catalyst within the body which suddenly shifts the focus of the individual from what Freud called the polymorphic perversity of the ego to the felt presence of the other, conceived in that case as a sexual partner. And sex, which had never before been an issue, or which had only very peripherally been an issue, suddenly becomes an absolute obsession, and pointing toward the attainment of syzygy with the mystery, fusion with the felt presence of the other in the form of early adolescent sexual experiences. Well, I have many times found myself saying to groups like this, what a tragedy that someone might go from birth to death without ever having the psychedelic experience. It is the birthright of an intelligent species. In the same way that I would hate to think of someone going from birth to death without the sexual experience. These are completing and illuminating and transcendental dimensions of experience which one must have in order to fully claim the dimension of humanness. Now, in the process of culture recapitulating ontogeny and phylogeny, we have reached our childhood's end. And our childhood was the world of naive Newtonianism, Hamiltonian atomic systems, a place for everything and everything in its place. We have come to the end of that process. Now we must invite the presence of a greater mystery. And in the same way that though we enter into the sexual dimension at adolescence, we leave it some 50, 60, or 70 years later, depending on how lucky we are, still without a full understanding of what went on. I'm sure you've all seen the little sign which says, we grow too soon old and too late smart. Well, it applies to sex as well as to the psychedelic experience. Now, as a culture, we must come to grips with the fact that the world is not simple, in the same way that a 9-year-old must come to grips with the fact that the world is not simple. It is not as Mommy and Daddy said it was. There are tremendous vistas and abysses to be plunged, and ask your uncle and he will tell you that nobody knows what's going on in these areas. Ask a shaman and he will tell you that nobody has found the bedrock of the psychedelic experience. Nevertheless, this wish to live with a bedrock of experience is a kind of trivializing of the great mystery in which we find ourselves embedded. We would have a far more accurate and complete picture of reality if we were willing to live with the felt presence of the mystery. And the way to do this is to experience what these plant teachers are trying to say, what these planetarily manufactured information-bearing pheromonal molecules are trying to imbue into us. Now, shamans throughout history have short-circuited the fall. They are those who know. That's what gnosis is. It is privileged knowledge vouchsafed to the courageous. And the fact that we have fallen into a childish or a neurotic style of relating to being is nothing more than a statement about the inherent biases of our languages and our institutions. Many peoples have not, perhaps because they carried out their lives in the vastness of the tropical forests, where the force of nature cannot be denied. You see, had we stayed in the tropics, we probably would never have taken the fall into history. The fall into history is what happens when one moves into progressively more and more barren landscapes and substitutes for the input of organic nature the self-generated neurotic maps that are based on incomplete information. Now that cycle is being closed. I often think that the discovery of the New World and its subjugation, which was like the carrying out of the ultimate fantasies of the neurotic Judeo-Christian tradition, a world to plunder, ends very oddly with Gordon Wasson and Valentina Wasson in 1953 penetrating into the jungle highlands of Mexico and finding there something more astonishing than a flying saucer or an alien artifact, finding there the true heritage of the human species in the form of the intact mushroom psychedelic religion. Eros, lost since the dismemberment of Osiris, lost since great Pan's death at the rise of the Christian era, but not dead, only sleeping. And now, through cultivation techniques and the propagation of ethnographic literature and the work of people like Metzner and Hoffman and Wasson and Schultes, shoved directly in the path of the careening cultural juggernaut of Western civilization. This is why I've called the weekend Psychedelics Before and After History, because I see history, as I say, as a prodigal hiatus, a wandering in the desert of unknowing, an indulgence in an easily cured neurosis, if we will but take upon ourselves the personal responsibility for cultivating a relationship with the mystery. We have bought in so thoroughly to the notion of a hierarchy of information and a declension of truth from experts, whether they be politicians, priests, or scientists, that we have devalued ourselves as the primary instruments of our knowing. And this is why I think, among other reasons, why psychedelics are so repressed, why it is so important to society to keep them out of the hands not only of children and high schoolers and hedonistic experimentalists, but to keep them out of the hands of research psychologists, pharmacologists, and physiologists as well, because fully appreciated, they will explode the Newtonian, Einsteinian universe the way a stick of dynamite explodes a rotten apple. And in the process, the hierarchies of paternalism, scientism, and reductionism will just be completely swept away. And this is all going to happen, God willing, in our lifetimes. My faith is that if it doesn't happen, then the cultural momentum toward a lethal conclusion will continue unto the ultimate catastrophe. And so that's why I am willing to address groups like this and seek to inspire psychologists and chemists and students of anthropology and culture to examine this, because I think we have wandered far from our birthright and trivialized the mystery of being in the process. And to recoup that mistake, we are going to have to become as little children in the face of the shamanic phenomenon and investigate it intellectually, experientially, linguistically, individually, and collectively. Only in that way will we be able to rescue the enterprise from its momentum toward catastrophe. Let's not forget that each one of us is here in this room because, 1,000 or 10,000 generations of thinking beings did not drop the ball. However tough it was, 9 times the glaciers have ground south from the poles in the last 150,000 years. 9 times they have retreated. This planet has witnessed all kinds of catastrophes and symmetry breaks, and still the trust, the implicit trust that the environment must have in us as the catalytic species, and we are the catalytic species. Everyone is worried about the impact of humankind on this planet. Well, let me tell you, before the pyramids ever rose, the impact of human beings on this planet was staggering. The CO2 level had been affected, the grasslands had been created, the great mammals had become extinct. All of this is tolerated because we are the prodigal sons. We are the pride of the planetary parent, because we are the omni-adaptable catalytic species that, if able to carry out the program which consciousness endows us with the power to impart, we will be able to carry the biosphere of this planet throughout the stellar system in which this solar system is embedded. And life has this atemporal sense of itself. The reason it tolerates the risk that we represent is because it is gambling on the hope that we represent. And the way to get aligned with that and to get in resonance with it is to clear the noise from the circuitry of communication. And the way you clear the noise from the circuitry of communication is by backing out of the garbage of profane culture, reductionism, linearity, all of these things, and abandoning the fall into history and returning to the garden. If we each do it, it will be fait accompli for the collectivity. If we all sit around waiting for it to come in the form of benevolent extraterrestrials or a religious conversion on the part of Reagan and Gorbachev, we will all go to hell in a handbasket together. So that is the stunningly central import of the botanical hallucinogens in the planetary ecosystem. And that is this evening's formal presentation as well. Thank you very much. As I understand it, there is tea and coffee downstairs. Let's take a 10-minute break, and then I will entertain vigorous and even hostile questioning by the audience. And here is the various sorts of propaganda that I mentioned earlier. Thank you very much. It's later than we think, so I'm not sure it was up to me to call this back together, but I will do so. I know there are people with questions. Before I take questions, I was handed an express mail package in the intermission. Robin Sylvan, who some of you may know as the former director of the Ojai Foundation, is now running something called the Fairhaven Mysteries Project in Bellingham, Washington. And Kat and I have agreed with him to do a 9-day pilgrimage in Hawaii this coming January at the Botanical Garden site there. And it's been named Volcano Orchid Mind. So if any of you, I don't have enough of these flyers for everyone to get one, but if any of you think you might wish to and can afford to spend 9 days with us in Hawaii next January, I'll just leave these out for interested parties. And if there aren't enough to go around, why share at least the informational contact with other people. Okay. Is there anybody burning to ask a question? Yes.
Terence, what are your views on some non-botanicals such as MDMA and ketamine, which are currently...
Well, I think I implied in the talk, I really as the longer I deal with this problem, the more strongly I feel about it. It began as a sort of a very gentle separating, and it's become more and more clear to me that, and I guess I rely on Rupert Sheldrake to give me a basis for saying this, drugs which come out of the laboratory have no history. They do not vibrate with millennia of usage or with being products of the natural environment. They are, as I implied in my lecture, somewhat onanistic. So I view them as drugs. And drugs do different things. Some drugs stimulate you, some depress you, some may even cause the release of personalistic content or repressed traumatic material. Drugs are for people who are ill, is basically my approach to it, while botanical hallucinogens are for extremely healthy people who want to go deeper into experience. I've tried the drugs that you mention. I've certainly found them interesting, but I could not imagine building a career around communicating with people about them. To my mind, what's interesting about them is the contrast with the informational depth of natural hallucinogens. I think the word drug applied across the board to MDMA, ketamine, and psilocybin, mescaline, and those kinds of things does great injustice to the natural compounds. There really should be a linguistic distinction made. So I try to speak of organic substances, or more specifically plants. I don't deny the worth or the efficacy of these laboratory compounds, but they are not planetarily evolved pheromones carrying the messages of Gaia. They are humanly constructed nanotechnological machines useful for intervening in the personalistic dynamics of the psyche. Emmett.
What do you know? Who did you call?
Emmett.
Okay. What do you know about AIDS as a germ warfare?
AIDS as a germ warfare. Well, I don't know anything. I certainly have noticed that within 10 years of the discovery of retroviruses, which the AIDS virus is, you know, one of the dogmas of molecular biology was that there was never transcription from RNA to DNA. It was always from DNA to RNA. Then they discovered the so-called family of retroviruses. Within a very few years, 3 or something after that, AIDS appeared with its curious political selectivity. I mean, this is a drug which goes after homosexuals, people who shoot intravenous drugs, black people, and loose people. If they could have just somehow gotten the Tay-Sachs thing in there too, so it would have gotten Jews, I'm sure they would have really been pleased with themselves. If it is, in fact, a piece of political engineering, I don't know that it is, but I certainly notice its curious selectivity. If it is, you may be sure that this is a secret buried far deeper than anything having to do with Auschwitz or Watergate or anything else. You want to talk about a crime against humanity. This is a crime against humanity on a previously inconceivable scale. There's been a lot of speculation about this. Granted, some of it has emerged from East Bloc countries, but on the other hand, it's well documented that other bacteriological and chemical agents were tested in this very city in the 50s and 60s. Some of you may know the incidents that I'm referring to. So it's a possibility not to be ruled out, certainly. I said that you would be next. Yeah.
You talked about the psychedelic experience and the mushroom, contrast to, but similar to, and also a mystical state or achieving enlightenment through other means not drugs. My understanding somewhat has been that the use of yoga or meditation or whatever to achieve these states would produce ultimately some kind of a permanent state of mind that would alter one's consciousness, if it is indeed able to be achieved that way, that would alter one's consciousness 24 hours a day. With drugs, your suggestion is there's an easier way to learn similar things about this state of being or whatever through drugs. But
through
I know
plants,
that,
really.
Through plants, but I know that you take a drug and you have experiences and certain kinds of realizations, and then you come down. So do you feel that there's some kind of program for ingesting the mushroom, or would it become something that would become part of your diet, or do you reach a state where you do indeed achieve sort of a permanent symbiosis?
Well, I think that your point is well taken. Nevertheless, the mushrooms, the psilocybin, affects the imagination. It is a stimulant to the imagination. And I don't really think that that is dissipated, or if it is dissipated, it's very slowly. Also, I'm not entirely convinced of the claim of the yogic schools that they can lock in these extraordinary states permanently. It seems to me that the shamans that I have had acquaintance with certainly are not abusers of these substances. On the other hand, they are regular users. And I think that it's fine that the insights are tested against the momentum of down reality. Yoga, most schools of yoga, in fact I believe all schools of yoga, can be traced back to the 2nd century, the Yogic Sutras of Patanjali. Well, Patanjali explicitly states that light-filled herbs, his phrase, light-filled herbs, are one of the legitimate paths to achieving these high states. Certainly, if you look at the Rig Vedas are a vast and enthusiastic paean of praise to something called Soma, which was greater than Indra, greater than the gods of the old Vedic pantheon, the central mystery of the Vedic civilization. Gordon Wasson has argued very persuasively that it was a mushroom of some sort. So I really believe that if we had a completely clear picture of the evolution of Indian culture, we would see that for some reason, open at this point in history and looking back at it only to speculation, an institution of botanical shamanism was transformed into the notion of a lineage and a secret teaching and a set of physiological practices. So the issue of permanence is a kind of an odd one. Obviously, once you are not always stoned if you take a hallucinogen, a plant hallucinogen, but I am living proof that you're never the same. So somewhere between always stoned and never be the same is where one falls. Yes?
This grasp of the verbal language. Is that one of your changes?
Well,
what were you like in high school?
Different questions. No. I've thought about this a good deal because people keep bringing it up, and I find myself saying, that it synergizes command of language and so forth and so on. But the most honest answer I can give you is I was always glib. And in high school, we had a big forensics scene going in my high school. Well, you had two choices. You could be in debate or extemp. And I said, so what is debate? And they said, well, you stay after school and you make 3x5 cards on resolve that the General Association of Trades and Tariffs should admit the United States as a member. And I said, okay, so what is extemp? And they said, you go in cold and you draw 3 topics out of a hat, and you have 3 minutes to choose one of them and prepare a 15-minute talk. And I said, I'll go with that. And I was very, very good at it. But as I grew up and went to Asia and wandered around, as a freak, basically, I had no sense of myself as having great verbal facility. I discovered that really on the mushrooms. And if any of you, there's a book I can recommend that is excellent reading on the subjects we've been talking about. It's edited by Michael Harner, although he does not make a contribution other than to edit it. It's called Hallucinogens and Shamanism, and it contains about 9 articles on various plants with shamanic usage. Henry Munn, who is an anthropologist who has spent a lot of time in the Oaxacan highlands, has an article in there called The Mushrooms of Language. And he says, they catalyze language, they catalyze verbal facility. And we don't know what the basis of the well-documented traditions of oral poetizing that we find when we go back into the Western tradition. It still exists in rural Yugoslavia. We don't know what the factors were that created that. I think that most people who take plant hallucinogens are simply inspired to attempt to clean up their communication skills, because you do wish to communicate it. And it's the stereotyped view of the intoxicated mystic in our society is of an idiot, the inarticulate hippie, the guy who just says, well, man, it's like, In my experience, that is not what it is at all. They are an extremely potent catalyst for communication. Yes, the blonde woman in the back, and then...
Do you think it's possible through artificially created hallucinogenics to program someone, even if maybe just from one really good trip, to program them perhaps to change in their whole outlook on life? I get the idea with what you're speaking of with natural substances, you're bringing out something that's already in you, or allowing some consciousness that perhaps isn't tapped. I'm speaking about introducing perhaps some foreign consciousness into your mind through chemically altered substance.
Do you mean as in a control or in a psychoanalytic sense, like curing an addiction or an obsession?
No, I'm talking about like having been given acid at one point, and even many years later, still sometimes having like flashbacks on it and wondering what perhaps might have been in that drug or what it did to you.
Well, I think that the most complex phenomenon in our world is the human psyche. And one does occasionally meet people who are horrified by my position and say, I took LSD 25 years ago and it's taken me this long to get it back together, and even now I don't feel that together. To me, the psychedelic is responsible only in the sense that it gave an X-ray of the psyche to the ego. And people who have been severely traumatized or abused or molested as children, who have real problems, are going to discover the breadth and depth of this traumatic material, and it may inhibit their ability to set themselves free and become great psychedelic explorers. I don't advocate this for everyone. In fact, I counsel people, and I don't always tell people they should go ahead with their plans if they're contemplating a psychedelic experience. Sometimes I tell them they need to do more reading or have more therapy, and sometimes I tell them they shouldn't do it at all. It's a calling. Shamanism is a calling, and in traditional societies, shamans pick and choose very carefully who they will take on as apprentices. So it's by no means a given that everyone is going to find these things to their taste. On the other hand, those who do find it to their taste will inculcate it into their lives very readily, and it will become very important to them, their self-definition, and their psychic growth. To address possibly another aspect of your question, is it possible to program people with these drugs, or a combination of these drugs and hypnosis and that sort of thing? I have no doubt that it is. The little bit that we see, that we are able to get declassified from CIA experiments in the 60s, is hair-raising. I mean, they dreamed of people who would commit acts of violence or assassination and then completely forget that they had done it. Now, how far down the road with these kinds of programs they got, we don't know to this day. I am very careful about who and what I am around in a state of psychedelic awareness, because you do imprint these things, and that's why, in the same way that the shaman chooses his apprentice very carefully, the apprentice should be very aware of choosing the teacher very carefully. You, sir.
Yeah, I've had some major experiences with LSD in terms of ego death and just a complete crushing of my psyche and my point of view, and then have come through into some brilliant light and really a very spiritual experience. And I'm only now starting to play with the mushrooms for more of that experience. I wonder if you could relate if the mushrooms have the potential to have that painful aspect of the crushing and the ego death kind of experience. So far, I haven't had that kind of experience with the mushrooms.
Well, a very nice thing about the mushroom is that it's extremely tolerant of beginners. Nevertheless, downstream from those early experiences, you're dealing with, call it the overmind, the superego. It will give you not what you want, but what you need. And it can be extremely painful. It can be extremely humbling. It can be terrifying. It seems to me, in the people I have known and in looking at my own trips that had that quality to them, it's always to the good. The ego is completely obsessed with control and wants everything to be ameliorated and presented in easily digestible increments and to proceed along an orderly program of unfoldment. And it isn't like that. It has its own weather, it has its own dynamics, and you're much more in the position of someone sailing alone in a small sailboat. You can check the weather very carefully, and this will give you an edge. Nevertheless, squalls can turn into great storms with astonishing rapidity, and yet then you're in a position to really learn. But the learning is not, the real intense learning is not necessarily painless. And I see people nodding their heads all over the room. It is not for the faint-hearted. It just simply is not for the faint-hearted. People talk about how there are no frontiers left, and we lead such coddled lives within this society and in our well-furnished apartments with our stacks of CDs and all this. Actually, it isn't true. You can turn your living room into the helm of Magellan's ship. It's simply that the great unexplored dimensions are internal and psychological, but no less dangerous for that. So it's a calling for the exploring spirit, someone who really wants that thrill. Yes?
Yes, if I understood you correctly, I thought you were saying that history is always profane, And I wonder if that's true, because I'm thinking of, say, the prophetic tradition, the idea of that there's a meaning in history, that there's social injustice. I'm thinking of someone like Martin Luther King, for instance, who sort of comes out of that tradition. Did I understand you correctly on that?
Not exactly. This is a distinction that Merciliade made in a book which was very important to me called The Myth of the Eternal Return, Cosmos and History, Myth of the Eternal Return. If you haven't read it, read it. It's a great book. And he simply set up these two terms, sacred and profane. And what he means is that sacred space is paradigmatic space. That means that it is ritualistic space. It is always involved with the repetition of an archetypal activity. He uses the Latin phrase in ilio tempore, which literally in English simply means in that time. But what it really refers to is the time before history. So the juxtaposition of sacred and profane is not a value judgment. It's simply a way of talking about two kinds of time. One that is cyclical and engaged in the ritual establishment of a kind of archetypal space, and the other that is linear and rational and proceeds from a beginning toward a future. No, obviously, history is studded with examples of great saintliness, great insight, great displays of compassion and understanding. So I didn't mean to imply that, and hope that I didn't. Yes?
Earlier you made an excellent delineation between laboratory-produced drugs and botanicals. The question is, are the effects of each of these two different on the subtle bodies of people?
Well, something more that I could have said about that, a very practical argument for botanical drugs, especially ones with a history of shamanic usage, is simply that they have a history of human usage. That's where the market testing was done over thousands and thousands of years. If a compound is toxic or triggers psychosis or mutagenic or induces tumors, it will have been dropped long ago by human groups who experiment with these things. Something can come out of the laboratory and be psychoactive, elicit some change in the self-perception of psyche, and can have all kinds of unknown or potential side effects. So what I always say to people, if I can reconstruct it here, who ask this kind of a question is, there are 3 tests to apply to a compound that you're thinking of ingesting. First of all, does it have a history of shamanic usage? Does it come from plants? Plants are also biological systems like us. They cannot produce truly alien compounds. And thirdly, does it have a relationship to known human brain chemistry? And I usually say to people, if you get 2 out of 3 on this test, it's probably okay to go ahead. But if it fails 2 of the 3 or 3 of the 3, I would steer wide of it. A perfect example, I mean, I don't want to dump on anybody's favorite drug, but just because I'm familiar with the literature, let me give an example. Ketamine. Ketamine is a fascinating experience. I had a lot of psychedelic experience under my belt before I came to ketamine, and I was amazed at what it does to psyche. However, there's a significant amount of literature which indicates that it can cause epileptic kindling. There is another significant body of literature which indicates that it depresses the immune system. to such a degree that it has now been dropped from general surgery. It's even, I understand, being dropped from veterinary use because all these vets were reporting that a very large percentage of cat patients were not recovering from quite straightforward operations, being spayed and that sort of thing. And ketamine begins to look like the culprit in that. Well, now, if it didn't have that bad rap, I would be willing to grant that it was a very interesting compound. But I just, my immune system is very precious to me, and also I find the notion of epileptic kindling to make me very uncomfortable. So in spite of the fact that the experience is quite interesting, I would go very slow with that. I certainly wouldn't settle into it as a lifestyle. So just to reiterate, does it come from a plant? That means that it is benign to life. Does it have a history of shamanic usage? That means that it is benign to human populations. And then this third thing, does it have an affinity with brain chemistry? Because you see, the brain views a drug as an insult to it. The brain has what is called the blood-brain barrier, and then behind that many enzymatic mechanisms for degrading any foreign substance and turning it into harmless substrates. The perfect case example would be dimethyltryptamine. Dimethyltryptamine is, without contest, the most powerful hallucinogen known to me, and I've spent a while looking into the matter. Okay, it does occur in plants. It does have a history of human usage in the Amazon basin, but what is most astonishing about it is when you smoke it, within 7 to 12 minutes, you completely return to normal. Now, what is happening there is that the DMT is crossing the blood-brain barrier very rapidly, giving you a phenomenal psychedelic experience, and enzyme systems are locking on to these molecules and saying, I know what this is. I know how to deanimate, dealkylate this compound and quickly turn it into indole acetic acid, which is a common excretory pathway for these kinds of compounds in the brain. So the speed with which DMT clears the human brain and returns you to normal is a very, very strong argument for its harmlessness. So if you take a drug and the next day you feel lousy and the next day you sort of feel okay, that's not a very good drug. That's an insult to the physical brain and should not be done because we're in this for the duration. This is a task of a lifetime. So you want compounds which are extremely effective in delivering the noetic experience, the plunge into the tremendum, but you also want to be able to race again another day. And that involves paying attention to these other factors. People who are contemplating this as an experiment or a lifestyle, this dealing with psychedelics as a growth program, the first thing I say to people is make a trip to the library. A great deal is known about these things. Read the physiological literature, read the ethnographic literature, and assimilate that data so that you're not just going into it blind. Take a little responsibility for what you're doing. I'm appalled at people who take 8 different kinds of drugs in an evening and tell me they have astonishing experiences. I'll bet they do. But that's not for the duration. You can't build a lifestyle on that kind of thing. What you want to do is have access into the dimension in a way that is clean and informed and ethical and intelligent. That's how these shamans in the Amazon do it. I was tremendously impressed by their authenticity and by their awareness of these issues. These people are not naive, as so much of the ethnographic literature insists. They are extremely sophisticated, obviously, in these matters, more sophisticated than we are. We have much to learn from them. That's why visionary and ecstatic shamanism is the model for doing this kind of exploratory work. Sir?
Okay, I got a question which is crucial to me, and I think everyone. The long version is you espouse two different positions, well, many, but these particular two. The first one acknowledges that it's possible to transform yourself or investigate your world in a different way, and thereby save the planet. So you were saying at one point that even though, individually, in the face of insurmountable odds, it's possible to actually do that. And you seem to be quite optimistic about that. It's obviously within your realm of possibility. That's involved with shamanism work and so forth. Now, on the other hand, obviously, a lot of people are aware there's a whole body of end-time scripts coming from shamans, from Indian tribes. I mean, going back to Nostradamus, there isn't, to my knowledge, maybe I'm wrong, but there exists this overwhelming body of prophecy, which is a lot of which was produced on these sort of psychedelic drugs. How do you reconcile those two positions, but with some sense of hope? I mean, how do you reconcile having free will to change them or save it? On the other hand, up against this monolithic block of information which says we're going to come up against this stuff very soon. The short question is, how do you avoid getting the horrors when you're tripping into the modern world?
Okay, what about these, as you so aptly put it, these end-time scripts? The only one which is truly pessimistic is the fundamentalist interpretation of the Judeo-Christian appetite for apocalypse. That is a lethal script for the planet in which only 144,000 are saved. I agree and participate in the generation of these end-time scripts, but what I always say is it's an ontological transformation of categories, not the toxification or explosion of the planet. That is a unique point of view claimed by these Christian groups, and I think to the degree that they do that, they place a heavy burden on the rest of us. It's bad enough that we have these nuclear arsenals and the capacity to destroy ourselves without having an explicitly stated death wish as a cultural ideal. So I will, it's a question of apocalypse or millennium. And I believe that it will be a millenarian unfolding beyond the end time, not a cessation of life and a general judgment and a consigning of 99.99% of us to eternal damnation. How do you avoid getting the willies? A lot of people do get the willies when they are tripping and they come up against this end-time stuff. I think that the only cure is to stick with it. I always think of Frank Herbert's excellent advice that he puts into the mouth of his character Muad'Dib in Dune. He says, when the fear comes, it comes like a great wind. And what you do is you simply clamp down and wait, and it will blow itself out. One of the first things a psychedelic voyager must learn to do is to discipline the hind brain. The hind brain is a creature of fight or flight, and you must just turn to that and say, now see here. We are neither going to fight nor fly from this. We are simply going to freeze and watch, and the fear builds up. It's a chemical thing, and it builds up, and then those same systems that destroy the DMT, that deanimate and dealkylate it, will take the fear apart before your very eyes and leave you in peace. So we are in a great temporal vortex. This is not the subject of tonight's lecture, but it is the subject of much of my thinking. The fact that we are being funneled toward a kind of ultimate historical crisis. To the degree that you have bought in to the assumptions and values and aspirations of historical society, it's going to look to you like the world is just flying to pieces. To make it make sense, we have to decondition ourselves from those values and those assumptions and realize that we are embedded in the body of Gaia. The creode along which the development of life on this planet is being propelled has walls which are extremely steep and high. There is very little possibility of us jumping out of that groove and creating a kind of apocalypse for ourselves and the planet, because we are not, in this matter, free agents. This matter of whether or not the planet shall be destroyed is something which the overmind or the superego of the species reserves unto itself. The proof of that in the present historical moment has got to be that a bloodthirsty nudnik like Ronald Reagan will sign an IMF agreement. If it is in the interests of people like that to support disarmament and disengagement and rethinking of the lethal momentum of history, then how much more it will be a part of the program of those who will eventually replace these people. We have reached the point, I think, where ideology has given way to a perhaps even more base desire, the desire to make a buck. And it is bad business to have thermonuclear wars. Therefore, the hysterical war hawks of capitalism, or of not even capitalism, but this fundamentalist, self-righteous, demagogic democracy, and of Marxist, millenarian, save-the-world types, has been completely read out of the picture. Governments are growing more and more irrelevant, while banking, commerce, and investment are beginning to dictate terms to these institutions. It is bad business to blow up the world, and this is the great salvation of all of us, even though we may not be particularly keen on the business ethic or mentality. So I'm very optimistic. I think great changes will be seen in our lifetime, and I think the lethal mythologies are being overthrown very, very subtly by the superego, by placing goals that even the dullest of us will turn to in preference to waging a thermonuclear war. Anyone else? Yes.
Just interested a little bit in the vision you have for a post-historical relationship between the people and the technology that they create, which they sometimes go crazy with. It fills us the glasses and the other good things that improve our...
Well, I think that culture is a dimension, literally, and that for 10 or 15,000 years, it has been a very low dimension. In other words, if you think of it as a dimension orthogonal to nature, it has been just a slight adumbration of nature. But now we are taking unto ourselves, through human-machine interfacing and nanotechnology and this kind of thing, this dimensionality of culture is becoming rather more expanded. So my notion of a post-historical world is a world where all of the technological appurtenances of the present world have been shrunk to the point where they have disappeared into and are scattered as grains of sand along the beaches of this planet. And we all live naked in paradise, but only a thought away is all the cybernetic connectedness and ability to deliver manufactured goods and data that this world possesses. So really, when I see the historical process running off the scale, it is not that we are destroyed at the end of it. It's simply that it runs off the scale into another dimension. Culture is where we are all going to live, but culture need not be something which is toxic to nature. It need not come tangential to nature at all. It can be in an entirely different dimension. This is why I often talk about what I call living in the imagination. The imagination, which begins as a slight, almost a flicker of iridescence across the mental world of ordinary reality, is going to grow and self-reinforce and expand until it will be virtually all there is, if that's all one chooses to experience. Now, a person living in, let's say, Midtown Manhattan, they live in a dimension where nature has been entirely read out. The problem is it has been literally read out. It has been bulldozed into non-existence. What we need to create is the equivalent of Midtown Manhattan, but in a dimension such that it nowhere comes tangential to the body of the planet, either by scenario 1, the engineering scenario, by placing it in outer space, or scenario 2, the postmodern engineering scenario, putting it into nanotechnology, or scenario 3, the psychedelic engineering scenario, where we somehow put it into mind, whatever that is. So the post-historical world is the world where thought defines the modalities of being rather than the laws of physics and inertia. If wishes were horses, beggars would ride. Well, eventually, I think wishes will be horses and beggars will ride, but not across the surface of this planet, but through and across the endless grasslands of the imagination. One or two more, yes.
Is there anything to be said for MDMA because of its friendly nature, and just as a means of turning on large numbers of squares?
Yes, I think in my lecture I said that drugs are for sick people. Anybody who doesn't love their neighbor needs chemical or therapeutic intervention. And, if MDMA in the hands of a skillful therapist can do that, more power to it. But it addresses sort of trimming the fingernails of the ego, not these dimensions that I am talking about. Someone else, yes.
An area that you talked about that reminds me of something that I've been very interested in studying, we come to call it the ecology of history. Can you say something about why a culture that grew up or evolved in the tropics would be so different than one that grew up, what you said, barren land?
Because of the overwhelming presence of ordered organic systems at every level. I mean, if you don't have to grow up in the Amazon. If you're there 3 weeks, you begin to get the message that, my God, this is some kind of a brain. You take a lungful of air, and it's like a symphony of odors, which you know to be pheromones, carrying messages from one member of a species to another, from species to species. So then you shift your sensory focus to sound, and you realize, that languages are going on all around you, hundreds of them, between species, among species. The tropical rainforest is the most exquisitely ordered process on the planet, and any culture which grows up with that as its front yard is going to be a culture immersed in the Tao, inevitably, because you don't survive unless you come to terms with it on its terms. None of your rules count for anything. It sets all the boundary constraints, and you see the exquisite ordering, how it all works, the economy of form, the economy of resource, and the depth of its pure communication. So that's the great difference. Heinrich Zimmer, in his massive study of Indian art, says of the cultures that wrote the Vedas, he says their great breakthrough was they had no cosmic mountains, no sacred rivers, no holy spots. They worshipped fire, and where the sacred fire was kindled, the center of the universe came to be. They could erect this ritual space anywhere. This is, in a sense, a breakthrough in consciousness, but also it's a denial of the power of place, and it gives then permission for greater misuse and disregard of nature to come. And I view those Aryan people not as an Eastern culture, but as the furthest most extension of Western culture. They set us on this path as surely as the Greeks. So the two probably can be traced together somewhere south of the Caspian Sea. One last question.
Okay, I've heard you speak before of man's role in the mycological spreading of the mycological network of the mushroom. I wondered if you could, if you knew of how this is going in Europe and even beyond there, if home propagation is...
Oh yes, home propagation is now a worldwide phenomenon. It was a great change for the mushroom to become no longer an endemic of the grasslands of the tropics, but to become an endemic of the cellars and attics of the industrial democracies, bringing a shamanic ally into the very heart of high-tech culture, which it does very nicely. It teaches cleanliness, punctuality, discretion, all virtues that definitely need to be cultivated. So you see, it is a symbiotic relationship. What the mushroom is giving us is information about the world outside of and beyond history. What we are giving it is an extremely extended range, which is, by definition, one of the things that defines the successful adaptation of a species. So it isn't all going one way. It is not a parasitism by one upon the other, but definitely a real symbiosis. I'm sure many of you are aware that in the Amazon, one of the major life forms that quickly thrust itself upon your attention in any tropical forest are the leaf-cutting ants. They move in great coordinated streams, and they chop up leaves. They can strip a huge tree in hours. And what they do with these leaves is they take them back to their hive, and they chew them up and make a paste out of them and stick them all over the walls of their underground cavities, and then they place spores into this mulch not any spore, but spores that they have over the tens of millennia selected. These spores change the inedible cellulose of the leaves into edible sugars, and the ants eat those sugars and thrive. So the symbiotic relationship between social animals and fungi is a very well-established phenomenon of the biome of this planet. And in fact, isn't it interesting that the social insects are the one other area of organic nature where we begin to see similarities with our own style of social organization. They use chemicals to communicate. We use small mouth noises. But if the scenario I laid out for you this evening is correct, both societies were called into being through symbiosis with fungi that were operating in a mutual, a reciprocal relationship of mutual reinforcement and support. So it's a model that has been tried before, and it's generally agreed that these leaf-cutting ants are the most sophisticated of all the social insects. So the mycological mind seems to do this. It can take primates or insects and through the slow passage of the millennia organize them into great self-reflecting societies held together by communication. The breakthrough with us was with a much larger brain, with a much stronger hand. We have then evolved a kind of open-ended symbiotic relationship with the mushroom, while the insect societies have been caught in a closed loop, probably because of the small size of their individual brains and their limited ability to manipulate physical matter. But the principle is the same. The distinguishing difference is that our relationship with the mushroom is open-ended and promises a bright future not only for ourselves and the mushroom, but by implication for all life on the planet. Because as we come to realize the ethics of biology, we will cease to be so xenophobic and homocentric and much more willing to see ourselves as the stewards of the planetary garden. And this is, I think, ultimately what the psychedelic experience and what psychedelic shamanism leads us into: stewardship of the planetary garden in order to create an endlessly self-transcending horizon to all of our futures. Thank you very much.